Welcome back to the new School Sensei podcast. So I'm your host, Lance Douglas. We got Ken Douglas. He is the master of the ecological approach, I think. Isn't that right, Ken? No, Kenny's very much a newbie. But we'll try and upskill him today. And then I feel very, very honored to have Josh Peacock. So he's from Combat Learning, if you guys don't know. And with teaching martial arts, Josh's podcast at Combat Learning is probably one of the first out there. So the big dogs in skill acquisition for our industry, martial arts, you have Rob Gray. Well, he's big dog for everyone. Greg Souders. And right next to him, maybe pushing Greg out of the way, is Josh Peacock. So that's a big pump up for you, Josh.
Yeah, it's maybe too much of a pump.
You reckon you could take Greg, couldn't you?
In a fight, no. In a debate, probably.
There you go. But yeah, so Josh's experience, so he's got an extensive Taekwondo experience in karate. Taekwondo coach, I believe. You did a lot of the Olympic style. You have experience in the Pumse as well?
Yeah. So I'm not an active coach right now. I would like to get back into it soon. But I did coach it for a while. I started in the point break style, and then I found my way to the Olympic style in early adulthood.
That's it. And then Josh's main contribution to the martial art industry would be his Combat Learning podcast website. So one of the best academic minds in martial arts, because normally a martial art coach is someone typically, maybe not nowadays, but typically there'll be someone who kind of drops out of high school, maybe works at a local Coles or Macca's. So Coles is maybe, what's the equivalent of like a grocery shop in America?
Well, you've just like a local one or a Walmart.
Yeah.
Like Walmart's pretty common.
Yeah.
It's a mega corp.
So typically a martial art coach is not well educated, not many good career prospects, and they kind of fall into coaching just a way to make a living. So I think that's a good way to start this, because we wanted to get you in, Josh. We're going to ask you, quite a few different questions. One of my first ones would be, I'd like to have a chat about how do you go coaching the coaches, like converting them to the constraints-led approach?
Yeah, well, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. So it's a long process. There's some people I know that started out very antagonistic. They were antagonistic when I had first started the podcast. And later on, either they reached out or I just happened to see a snippet from them on a social media somewhere. They finally came around, and everyone has a different way in. Some people look at the constraints-led approach and they're like, oh, that makes sense. Immediately makes sense. And then the process there is really just to learn more about it in particular and just to start practicing with it. Other people are they're very resistant to it. It challenges a lot of their deeply held beliefs about learning and training and how things are supposed to be when you do martial arts. So they have an immune response to it. And most of them, I think, so far have not decided to change their mind, but a few do. So I've experimented with all kinds of different angles and ways of simplifying things and explaining how things work. And what I found is that you have a few people that are real thoughtful and they're willing to indulge you and let you ask questions to them that kind of poke and prod and make them think. But a great many people do not have much tolerance beyond one or two questions. If they feel like you ask a question that they're not going to be able to have an answer to, because martial artists, especially instructors, answer man. You got to have all the answers. They will sabotage the discussion immediately and either start making accusations or peace out. So it's I haven't quite figured it out, but the best thing I can think of is asking questions and providing as much easy to understand educational material as I can.
Well, what I like about like your podcast, Josh, is it's easy to link to the other coaches. So yeah, just I kind of, with us, we kind of link the guys to different podcasts, articles. We have found quite a bit of resistance. I know with me, like, when I first got into the constraints-led approach, it was through listening to Preet Mickelson. So you know how he's got
Okay.
those Globetrotter videos, and he might, like,
Yeah.
you know, he actually rambles for about 20 minutes and then shows about, you know, 5 minutes of technique.
Yeah.
And it was through the
Yep.
rambling, that's where I was like, okay, let's have a look into more of the coaching science. And that's where I found your podcast. I found Scott Siverite's as well. And then getting into Rob Gray's, getting into the weeds, and then reading the different textbooks.
Yeah, Preet is, I think he jumped on the bandwagon. I say that just tongue in cheek. He shared some of my work, and I'm deeply appreciative for that. He took an interest in it. I think that towards the beginning of last year, and he did something. He's known as the defensive BJJ guy, but when he did something really interesting to me when he started experimenting with the constraints-led approach. He took a cohort of beginners in his gym and did an offensive jiu-jitsu curriculum. And people with no exposure to jiu-jitsu before, they're total white belts. And he puts them through like 6 weeks of just offense instead of defense. And he was like really excited about the results, and apparently it was going really well. So I wonder, I should check up on how that went, if he's got a postmortem or anything like that. But I thought that was really interesting and an example of how playing around with the ecological approach can not just change the way you think, but get you experimenting with pedagogy in a way that can reinvigorate your own love of teaching martial arts and even produce really interesting, good results for you.
Let's, for our listeners, they might not know what the constraints-led approach is. So, Josh, would you be able to just like simply explain it, just for someone to easily understand?
Absolutely. So, if we think of the two athletes in combat sports, we think of them as a system, like an ecosystem almost. And the environment that the practice environment or the performance environment, the mat, the referee, all those things are a sort of ecosystem. All of that is information that influences the behavior of that system. So the constraints-led approach looks at a system where there's almost an infinite amount of ways it can coordinate all of its constituent parts. And it says, how in the world, with an infinite array of things you could possibly do you decide to do anything at all? And so with the constraints-led approach, we say, okay, so a constraint is any element in a system that influences the system by removing an entire set of action possibilities. Now, a constraint doesn't necessarily limit you, but it does remove sets of action opportunities. So Bernstein is a Soviet researcher. He's one of the foundational researchers in the ecological approach, ecological dynamics literature, which is the underpinning of the constraints-led approach. He calls it the degrees of freedom problem. You know, even just your body has so many different degrees of freedom that it's like, how do you figure out how to do anything at all when you're walking through space? So Carl Newell comes along. This is another psychologist, and he's studying infants, studying childhood development, developmental psychology. And we normally think of teaching and learning as something that needs to be taught to you explicitly, mostly explained, but also modeled. With really young children, they can see and try to mimic the people around them, but you can't explain things to children that are below 4 or 5 years old. Even 5 is, you're still pushing it. So you can't engage in the sort of instruction that you engage with elementary school students, with middle schoolers, adults, high schoolers. You just can't do that. So how is it that these little developing babies are able to develop often complex motor skills? They learn to walk, they learn to run, they learn to jump and climb. I mean, climbing is a wild one. Some kids get really good at climbing before they're good at walking. So like, how do they learn all of these skills? Well, the first thing is that they have a sense of their own bodies. So as they develop, their reflexes develop, their muscles develop, they start to feel strength, they start to feel that they can move, and so they begin to explore. That's the first type of constraint, is your organismic constraint. Or the individual constraints. Those are the influences and limitations that your body and all of its parts, the psychology, the physiology, all of those things, they have an inherent set of action capabilities, and then they kind of constrain out another set. Everyone's kind of built differently. They develop at a different pace. Then you have task constraints. That's what is it I intend to do? What's my intention? And then you have the environment constraints, and that's the structure that you can perceive around you of the world. And that removes an entire set of action capabilities. Because if you're stuck in a crib, you can't just jump 4 feet in the air and you have to find a different way to navigate that environment. So there's certain things that you just can't do because you understand your inherent action capability, and then you see the world around you, and you can, the structure clues you in on what you can do with those things. And so basically the interaction of all three of these types of constraints produce an emergent thing that we call movement behavior. And the theory goes with the constraints-led approach that the best way to help athletes develop skillful movement is to give them an environment that is constrained in such a way that they are going to find the information that they need to regulate their movement. And through a repeat process of navigating those environments, they are guided to skillful movement solutions. Now, what that doesn't mean, because I've seen this on some podcasts that are big that shall remain nameless, it doesn't mean that you contrive environments in a way that you force students to produce one solution or one technique that you're looking for. That's to backdoor the traditional sort of instruction-heavy model into the constraints-led approach. Two of the key principles of practice design in the constraints-led approach are repetition without repetition, which is a Bernstein thing, and constrain to afford. I'm writing an article on constrain to afford because I haven't addressed it enough yet, but I've addressed repetition without repetition quite a bit. So repetition without repetition, this is a practice principle of having as much variability in a practice as you intelligently can. So you don't want to spend a practice on one position, one situation. You want to have a number of situations that represent that have some overlap with the sport that you're doing or the performance environment. Constrain to afford is when you design the games that you use to practice in these environments, you want to create problems to solve. And so with constrain to afford and repetition without repetition operating together, you want to make sure that when you design a movement problem to solve, that there are multiple ways to solve it. There's always multiple ways to solve it. And that's because we learn better when we can discover our own way of doing things. And sometimes it's not optimal at first, but the systems always tend towards efficiency over time. So if you just give somebody enough exposure to a certain problem situation and let them solve it in as many different ways as they see fit to solve it, not only will they be more adaptable and have more ways of solving it, their favorite ways of solving it will also get better over time as well. So that is that's the constraints-led approach in a nutshell. There's other practice principles, but that's I think that encapsulates it.
What do you reckon, Kenny? How's that sound to you?
That sounds really good. So when we booked you in, Lance actually showed me your he was obviously talking about you a lot, and I was actually reading your Teaching Martial Arts 7 Concepts That Will Transform Your Classes and Your Students. And I learned a lot just from reading through that. And I guess like a lot of those topics that you just talked about then are in this as well. But It'll be very
Yes.
interesting. Yeah. So it'll be pretty cool because you're talking about that new concept, constrained to afford.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something I've never heard of. So I'll be interested to hear about that once that article's all done.
Yeah. Well, I can explain more to you now. So afford, I forget that one is, that's afford. We understand the word afford in terms of like, do we have enough money to buy something? And we could, and the basic premise of that is if you have the resources available, there's an opening available to you to purchase something or to trade or to exchange. James Gibson, who is another probably one of the top two researchers in the ecological dynamics approach, he coined ecological psychology, which is actually not a theory of like the things internally that drive you. When we think of psychology, we think of the things internally that drive you. It's actually a theory of perception. And so James Gibson, he looks at the way that we perceive the world, and he says we don't need all of these black boxes that we tend to think of inside of our mind as structuring the world for us. He says actually we're directly perceiving the world, and the structure, the visual structure, the ambient optic array, are cluing us into immediately what we can do. So it doesn't have to be processed through models in your head. Through experience with the environment or with similar elements from across environments, you are able to comprehend basically immediately, if you can see the environment, how it is you can act on all the elements of the environment. And so to describe what he calls invitations for action, I think Kelso calls it that, but invitations for action, openings for what you can do. In terms of martial arts, we think of it in terms of openings, to strike, to score, to defend. This would be, he calls this an affordance. That's his term. So an affordance is a little bit technical language, but an affordance is every invitation for action that you perceive in the environment. And so affordances kind of blur the lines between the objective world outside of you and then your subjective experience, because affordances are kind of scaled to you, but you're also perceiving actions that other people perceive they can do, with large overlap. So it's not entirely subjective. So as your athletic ability and your skill grows, some affordances will become more inviting. Some affordances that you didn't see available will become available. And the more often you take advantage of those affordances, the more likely you are to notice them and take advantage of them in the future in a skillful way. So that's a major concept in understanding the constraints-led approach, is understanding that we're not trying to memorize techniques, find some sort of cue, a contextual cue, and then just run the program like a computer program. We're actually constantly perceiving at all times, and based on the information that we're presently getting, we assemble movements to the affordances that we see, things that we think that we can do. We make mistakes sometimes, but the more skillful we get, the more precise we are, and the fewer mistakes we make.
Yeah, an example, Kenny, just so you can get a good picture of it. Say if maybe in sparring you see a student, they use their cross, but they're not using their jab. So traditional model of learning would be, okay, we'd stop the class, we get them rep out maybe 100 jabs. Maybe I'll show them a couple of jab combinations. We might rep out, maybe go on body, head. Whereas the constraints-led approach, what they might do, to constrain the sparring, they might say, okay, have one hand behind your back. So then the player is forced to use their front hand, and then they're forced to practice their jab. So the affordance, the opportunity for action, they would just have to see it. They'd have to problem solve it, because if they don't, then they're going to get hit. So that would be the kind of that's how you would implement it.
I like it. Sounds good to me.
Yeah. Going back, Josh, so you mentioned a lot of coaches, so we're getting on the constraints-led approach bandwagon. We're over-constraining the activity. So can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, for me, the biggest example, and I did this too, and I think almost everyone does it, it's like, if you think you're going to get good at the jab, all you do for the entire class is jab sparring. And so it's like jab against jab. That's over constrained because the jab has a number of functions that you're not learning to use it for when it's just jab against jab. And what's going to happen is the tactics that the two players develop in order to score jabs on one another are going to be really funky and not adaptive to an actual boxing match, because you have more tools available, more things you can use to combine strikes together to create openings, to exploit and act upon openings, to hide shots, to draw in shots. All these sorts of complexities and nuances you can use to become a really good boxer. Those things, most of them are gone when it's just jab against jab. So for me, I like to say that it's okay to start with a low level of variability, but you want to scale up as quickly as possible and not spend a lot of time in those sorts of environments. I think one way to make the jab sparring low variability for a player, but still very useful, is to let one player retain use of both hands and tactics with both hands, whereas one player has to score and defend using footwork in the jab. And I think that is more useful because now the jab as a stopping mechanism, as a counter mechanism, those are all available to the player. And of course, you want to flip-flop and let the other player have the same chance to work on it. I think that's much better. And you can do that a couple times in class, and then I would definitely open it up and find other ways to incentivize exploration of jab use without totally constraining out use of other tactics. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you reckon you could help the students get better at their jab without doing jab sparring?
Sure. Yeah, I think so. One way you could do it is, and it would depend on the function. So, and I think of this similar to the way I think of also like with some of the Taekwondo stuff I've been talking about. So like one of the features of a stiff jab is to make another player respect your space so they don't just bowl you over, which is, if you're a timid fighter and you're a little bit too, and you're a little bit too timid, it's easy for a more aggressive player just to invade your space and sort of steamroll you. So one of the ways you can stop somebody from steamrolling you is to pop them real good in the face, and make sure that jab doesn't move if they're coming in real strong. And so you could set up a sort of territory game where the jabber has to protect encroachment into that space, and if he fails to protect it, he loses the game and they flip-flop or it starts over or something like that. I don't know. Thinking on the fly, I don't know how many tactics I would give to the encroaching player, but there's probably different ways that you could. That's one I would experiment with a lot and just see what breaks when you try it, and then adjust constraints based on what's not working. And if nothing works, then just stop doing it. But yeah, protecting territory, finding ways to, find angles, and using the jab to understand range and set up combinations. That's another function of the jab.
Would you do any sort of
so you could no
so
I wouldn't do any pad work, and the reason why is, so let's take a piece of conventional knowledge about boxing and analyze it for a second in through the lens of pads. So one of the functions of a cross is to cross over a jab and hit the face. So with the right angle and distance and timing, you can counter a jab motion with a cross and land a blow. So the affordance to understand and properly time a crossover of a jab, you have to be attuned to the movement of the lead hand and the lead shoulder. Now, when you properly hold the pads, to cue a cross, you move the opposite shoulder as if you're going to throw a cross. And so the information that clues you into the coming technique is mismatched to what it is the function is that you're actually trying to get. Now, that's not the only function of a cross, of course. You can use crosses against crosses there's all kinds of weird stuff that you can figure out in boxing. But the information is all mismatched, and there's not really an honest element of timing, because everything is directly dictated either through verbal or through the gestures of the coach. You don't want people to be that reactive when they're sparring. You also want them to create opportunities, navigate and prospect for opportunities, create information, as we might say, in the ecological approach. So if you're going to use pads should be used for conditioning the limbs, generating power from weird angles in tandem with the heavy bag. I don't believe in paddles, pads, and bags or anything like that for skill that requires you to read the opponent and create a response to that, or even to actively create openings apart from counter tactics.
Interesting. If we want to riff on the jab, so just say if you went to a local comp and you saw like a bunch of your students, they really needed that jab, they just weren't properly managing, distance and all that sort of stuff. And you had a term training, like the next comp is in 3 months. How would you structure the training so that they would actually have that skill leading up to the next competition if it was 3 months away? And let's just say they have like 2 sparring sessions a week. Put you on the spot.
2 sparring sessions a week. Yeah. Well, I think you have to look at the individual, and if more open games are not working very well, I like the game that Lance was talking about, where you make them put their hand in their belt, or you tie the hand behind their back. Now, I wouldn't want them to stay there, but you're causing them, by removing a probably a maladaptive inclination of theirs, which is to not use the jab enough. Excuse me, I shouldn't have drank a soda. You're causing them to explore this foreign new ability that will probably become very, very useful to them, right? So if it's something that's legitimately holding their game back, then making them explore that, you might call it solution space, using just the jab, is probably a really great way to start playing with previous habits, right? In dynamical systems language or ecological dynamics, we use the same language as them. We would call that disrupting an attractor. So an attractor, you can envision a metaphor of like a road with potholes in it, ruts and potholes, and you have potholes that are like very small and deep. You have potholes that are big and long. You have ruts that can go for a half mile. The deeper the rut, the more likely the tire is to be sucked in as you go down the road. So attractors are tendencies you have in the way that you organize your body and the way that a system organizes itself, where certain tactics and certain behaviors are not 100% likely to occur, but are on a gradient scale much more likely to occur. So a shallow attractor is something that might happen, but is very, very unlikely to happen. And when you get stuck in a rut, and you actually need to correct a very ingrained attractor that's not doing you well, for whatever reason, is not working for you in a combat sports environment, then you want to find ways to disrupt the deep attractors and cause other attractors to equalize with that. So one gets shallower, one gets a little deeper. And optimally, you actually want there to be you don't want there to be a ton of very, very deep attractors, because it hurts your adaptability to novel circumstances. So if you ever get in a fight where something weird happens and you've very, very finely tuned, in the martial arts parlance, habit, we would say, you have very, very finely attuned habits, and then all of a sudden you're dragged into deep waters. If you don't have that baseline adaptability and you only have a couple of real strong games that you can go to, you're going to drown. You're going to freak out. You're going to get stiff. You're going to look like in some cases, you might look like you lack skill, because it's just so, you don't know what to do. You don't have that on the fly adaptability. And we see this sometimes in MMA. I mean, Israel Adesanya fought, why did I just blank on his name? Strickland.
Sean Strickland.
Yes, he fought Strickland, and Sean Strickland has no problem hanging out in the most uncomfortable sort of medium punching sort of range that most people don't want to be in. Now, Israel has a very darty game where he's excellent at manipulating distance, and Strickland marched him down to the edge of the mat, put him in a really weird region that Israel was not that familiar with, and a lot of his tactics went out the windows, and we found out that the style bender is actually not so much of a style bender after all. His game his game is awesome, but when you take him out of he had a very finely tuned game plan that looks spectacular and intricate and very adaptable. When Strickland took that away from him, he looked weird. He looked like a robot, like he couldn't do anything. And Strickland has his weird guard, like this, that he does, like all this weird stuff he does. He just is very comfortable. All he does is spar. Strickland, all he does is spar. And so he's just like, I'm not afraid to be right in front of you and stand and bang like this. And he beat him up. That's an example of when you don't have that like across the board adaptability, and somebody takes you out of your game, you have a brain fart and you look a lot less skilled than you actually are. And the only way to build that adaptability is to have so much variability in class, to give you so much exposure to different types of training environments and opportunities to try different solutions to the same problems, right? Different ways of getting the same task outcome. That's the only way to keep your affordance landscape of different solutions broad and shallow, which is actually a good thing, because you want to be able to use whatever you need in the moment and not just what you're most comfortable with.
I like that. So like essentially, if you're thinking short term, then of course you can give your students a few tools that are going to win a few competitions. But if you're looking long term, they need to have everything. Well, essentially, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. It would be very interesting to be coached by Sean Strickland to see how he coaches these classes. Obviously, hopefully that doesn't rant too much, but his class will be very interesting, I reckon.
Does he teach? I saw him beat the crap out of that streamer.
Oh, I think I've seen him.
I imagine his lessons are like that.
We're just sparring, to be honest. Yeah, Lance, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I think he spars a lot.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure. Oh, you might have a degree in skill acquisition.
Is that full?
You never know. You never know these guys. 100%. He knew from the start. Josh, you mentioned disrupting the attractors. What sprung to my mind would be differential learning. So, Ken, have you heard that term before, differential learning?
Yeah, quite a bit.
Oh, no, sorry, for Kenny. Ken, have you heard of it?
Oh.
Probably not.
No, I haven't heard of it. No.
Probably not. So differential learning is where you disrupt the environment so much and the task that it doesn't represent the sport. And it kind of, because it's so different, it's going to force you to try different things and problem solve in a different way that you never actually thought possible. So an easy one will be, say, in jiu-jitsu, rolling with eyes closed. Like, you never roll eyes closed, but rolling eyes closed, it would force you to be a bit more tactile, probably try and make sure you have 4 points of connection, all those types of things. So my question for you, Josh, differential learning for striking. What ideas would you have for that? And I can kind of see with striking, it's probably a bit more dangerous than grappling. So that's why I've never really tried any differential training with striking. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, differential learning for striking. Well, the first thing I'll say is that if you're going to use differential learning, my recommendation is to still maintain aliveness. I've seen some applications of it to combat sports that don't have aliveness, which I define as unscripted and uncooperative behavior. So I would say that, but beyond that, you can be very, very creative with it. So I think some ideas for differential learning is to, if you have the resources, to change the shape of the ring often, to change the orientation of the person at the start of the match. So you could put them on their knees and they have to get up and find a way to score and not be scored upon. You can set them backwards or to the side, so they have to reorient themselves at the start of the match. You can randomize the scores on the board when you start. So there's a greater degree of affectivity going on there. There's a lot of, if you start down on points and you've only got a minute to score a couple of points, that's going to put the fire under you. Some other things, I mean, just shooting from the hip. You can. Not a good idea to close your eyes in strike, I don't think, but low light, I think, would be really interesting. Different levels of light would be really interesting, because you can explore you can kind of figure out how much information about the movement of the opponent's body you actually need to be able to perceive in any detail in order to skillfully regulate your movements and get your task goal done. So that would be really interesting. You could also, similar to what you had mentioned before, you can take away limbs potentially at random. Maybe you can force them to throw at least one of a certain tactic. So you can give them like a wild tactic, like a spinning jump hook kick or something. You have to do it at least one time. Like there's all kinds of fun stuff you could do. Change the time. So you like have 15 seconds to score or at least 1 point or something like that. Like there's any number of ways I think you can break it down. If you can do it in rapid succession, I think that would be really, really interesting and fun way to conduct a class.
That's awesome. Yeah, they're good ideas. I'll have to try it next session. Probably Kenny mainly runs a lot of our striking. So yeah, there'll be some good ideas for you there, Ken.
I like it. If we bring it back to the topic of coaching coaches, from talking to a few coaches, a few of the things that they don't like about this approach, I'll just sort of just list them, and maybe if you want to riff on them, would be safety. Because if it's a lot of, things are happening all the time, when they do their step-by-step, systems, it's quite safe. They can control everything. They also talk about, like the commercial aspect, like retention. There's some people that just don't like to go live. There's some there's some gyms that just do technique a lot, maybe more like self-defense based gyms. And then there's gyms that roll a lot, have a lot of guys that go into competitions. So those are probably two of the things that I've heard from coaches: safety and that commercial aspect of you want to retain your members. And probably a third one would be they feel like they're not actually coaching. It's like they're more like sitting on the sidelines. They spend all this time, training, learning all these techniques. They want to be able to, showcase them. And if they're not showcasing them, they feel like, I guess their role as a coach, as an instructor, is probably not even needed. So do you want to riff on any of those sort of things that people are thinking?
Yeah, with the safety, the safety thing is a little bit of a mind goblin. It's a limiting belief. I'm sure it's possible to monumentally screw up the way you facilitate class, such that it is actually unsafe. But most of dozens and dozens of people doing this now, none of them have injury problems. In fact, their injuries almost always, this is anecdotal, but they from whom I've talked to, the injuries always go down. And that's because your body has a natural scaling ability that is underrated. And we don't really understand your ability to make adaptations apart from learning being the actual acquisition of a skill. Your ability to intercept objects, to catch, right? These are things you already have before you go to training to some degree. So what Scott Seavright does with striking is he starts them off with touching the shoulders and the hips, and then he scales it to topics, surfaces. He scales it to surfaces that actually represent kickboxing and MMA striking. And one of the main things that goes into this is you want to build a strong culture around safety and protecting yourself and protecting your partner. Greg Souders does this as well. You hear him talk about this all the time. He's got a lot of hot shots in his gym, but nobody's getting hurt because everyone's looking out for each other and making intelligent decisions for themselves. So if you, and you, I don't mean Ken and Lance, I mean just generally any person, if you have a fighter that is unable to scale and spar safely with other people, that is a failure on your part as a coach and your culture, your ability to enforce that culture that is masked by all of the busy work you do with pads and scripted exercises. I don't mean that to be, offensive. It's just an observation. If somebody cannot scale actions, all right, sorry, I'm trying to put some light on myself because it's getting dark. If they can't scale action and be safe with the way that they spar or roll, that's a problem. That's like barrier to entry to practice martial arts, in my opinion. So if they don't have that requisite scaling ability, then, what have you been doing? You don't spar? What's going on with your practice as a fight coach? Those are the questions that come to my mind. So if most people can scale and they develop that control faster than is believed. And like in karate, I know that there's this weird belief that you don't get control until like a middle or an upper belt, right? I don't know where this comes from because nobody actually tests when you get control. They just say, oh, you don't get control until like red belt or blue belt or black belt. But you can actually, if you give people the opportunity to engage in a live environment, they develop the control very rapidly. That's not to say they'll never make mistakes, but they develop the control very rapidly. And Scott Seavright has hundreds of people coming through his gym every year. They all do really well. They get better faster than people believe. Another friend of mine, Pedro Sierra, in Utah, also has a kickboxing program, and he does it live when he teaches the classes, and they don't really have these problems. So you want people to be looking out for each other. You want them to be tight knit. You want this to have a strong culture that when you bring a new person in, the members do their part to inculcate the new people into that culture and reinforce it, not just the coach. But the coach is probably the most important in the beginning of making sure that that policy and that culture is developed and enforced. What was the other
The
coaching bit?
Yeah, so the second one would be if you're talking more like it from like commercial aspects, so actually retaining students.
Yeah.
So like, you know, there'd be some coaches that say like, you know, the students almost want to collect techniques, you know, they want to be able to get the technique. It's like, yes, I can pull off that takedown, I can pull off that series, you know, whereas, you know, if you just want to rip from that one.
Yeah. So anecdotally, this only appears to be people with previous martial arts experience. They have been socialized into this sort of thing. My coach adopted this approach with his jiu-jitsu class, and I think he's gradually doing with the striking class. And the jiu-jitsu class, there's out of dozens, probably by now, hundreds of adults that have come through it. Kids don't care, by the way. Kids just literally don't care. They want to play. The adults that come through, they love this. They don't care about, you know, learning specific techniques every time they come into class. Sometimes they'll go and they'll watch YouTube and they'll bring something in to try, which is fine. You know, we learn by copying in many ways. It's different to see somebody do something and then try it out than to like have an instructor lecture you for 5 minutes and then make you go through the sequence before you can even try to use it. But the retention's very strong, and the idea that retention is based on you and your ability to deliver just the perfect right instructions. This is a limiting belief, I think, and it hasn't really proven true across any of the coaches I've spoken to or the gym that I train at. We think we're being useful. We feel useful when we can deliver all this copious amounts of detailed information. But all we ever do is deliver more and more and more, and we often have to repeat the same things over and over again, and you don't necessarily get better results out of it. You just eventually somebody gets it after you've vomited 6,000 words of the same 3 phrases to them over and over again. Eventually it shows up in sparring, you know, and did it show up because of they are sparring a lot, you know, and they finally kind of found the information they needed? Or did they finally do it because you said it enough times? You repeated the cue or the instruction enough time. I think I would skew on that there became a contextual need in the moment that led to that tactic finally emerging, or the strategy, rather than you repeating a bunch of words at them over and over again until they finally listen to the coach. The work that goes, there's a lot of things you can do to help guide attention, like to understand maybe where they should be focusing their attention on the opponent. You can do that in the moment as a coach in the constraints-led approach. You can even, if all else fails, you can even give them some instruction, some prescription, contextual to what they need in the moment, something that you see happening on the mat. You know, if other things just aren't working, I don't think that that's wrong. What's wrong in my eyes is to assume what everyone needs, give a lecture at the beginning of class. Don't let them try it in a live environment. They have to do some artificial fake script of things. And then maybe you'll let them try it in class. Like you'll let them loose in free sparring and you don't know if they'll actually try it or not. Right? That's the most common thing that I've seen. And if it's karate, you might never spar at all. So, so you never get a chance in some schools to even try it live. With the constraints-led approach, most of the work happens in your preparation of the session. You decide how it is you're going to deliver the task instructions. You want to let each player know what their task focus is, the thing that they are supposed to do for the point of that game. so they understand their intention, what they intend to do, and then let them organize themselves in a number of different ways through a process of exploration and discovery to try and fulfill the task for that game. So all of that, most of the work you're doing before you step on the mat is this really well structured set of different games and exercises based on what you see week after week from your mat to help address certain deficiencies. So there's an element of guiding, there's an element of structure and adaptability to the curriculum, and as much individuality as you can reliably scale, because the larger the class gets, the harder it is to make touch points. But lecturing the student or giving them copious amounts of detailed instruction, that makes us feel useful, but it's not very useful to the athlete, I don't think. So that's something that you're going to have to overcome. It's a psychological thing. And once you overcome it, then the possibilities for your new role as the new kind of coach, as a facilitator, as a guide, as somebody who opens up your ability to explore, all of those possibilities now flood in, and you can reconceptualize your role as a coach. The coach is very important. If you don't know anything about the sport, you're not going to design useful practice environments. You can't do it. I read some research that beginners are capable of making relatively intelligent choices for themselves, but it's a very limited range of things. You're not you have to become you have to understand jujitsu or karate, and then you have to understand the constraints-led approach. As there's all this stuff you have to know and practice. There's no way that somebody's signing up because they want to get in shape and master a skill or something. There's no way that they're going to remove the need for a coach to help them along as a guide and a facilitator. So I think people that are worried about that, it's just it's an anxiety. It's in a technical sense, it's irrational. And the more you practice and engage and get better at the constraints-led approach, you'll realize that it was, you were making a bigger deal of it in your mind than it really was. And that anxiety will go away. You'll feel more creative. You'll get better results, in my opinion, from what I've seen. And it'll all work out.
Yeah.
Boom. I think that's a good way to wrap it up, because I want to be cautious of your time. So thanks so much, Josh. That was awesome. Again, your podcast, listening, I think I listened to your first at least 50 podcasts. So I learn a lot through you. So
Wow.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks for coming in. I'm sure Ken, you would have got, because literally Ken knew nothing about the skill acquisition science. I sent him one of your articles. He's read it. So I'm sure hopefully this starts Ken's journey.
I've been doing it for a while,
yeah.
bro. But just not formally with all the lingo and stuff.
Yeah, I think with coaches, you don't really need to know the lingo as long as you do it. So, yeah, no, that's good to see. So for the listeners, if you want to check out more of Josh's stuff, check out his podcast, Combat Learning. Check out his website. Check him out on Instagram. And hopefully, if we could reconnect in a year, 2 years, then we can see where it's all going, all this constraints-led approach stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on, and thank you for all of the kind words.
Boom. Okay, we'll see you guys on the next one.